I think you'll find that most Americans really are capable of being national and cosmopolitan at the same time. Now, we're not as cosmopolitan as we are national. That goes back to my other example about the two children, that one of whom is yours, that there are additional moral obligations that go to being part of a national community. But the argument that somehow the sort of the Steve Bannon argument that it's cosmopolitans, rootless cosmopolitans against true American nationalists, this is nonsense. That's not who we are as a people.
Hello, welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, Director of Cambridge Forum, and today we are inviting you to escape intellectually and immerse yourself in some US history for an hour. We're going to consider the ethical performances of numerous American presidents from 1945 to 2020 in regard to their foreign policies. And this will span the administrations from FDR to Trump. This huge and rocky period of historical terrain forms the subject of Harvard professor Joseph Nye's latest book, Do Morals Matter? Presidents and Foreign Policy from FDR to Trump, published by Oxford University Press. In this latest book, Nye works through each presidency from 1945 onward and scores foreign policy on three ethical dimensions. One, intentions, two, the means employed, and three, the consequences of the presidential decisions. I'm extremely honored to introduce Professor Joseph Nye.
Thank you very much, Mary. It's nice to be back with Cambridge Forum, and that technology allows us to communicate even if not in physical presence at the church. People sometimes ask me why I would write a book called Do Morals Matter? With a question mark in the title. In fact, one friend, a woman, said, at least it'll be a short book. But the conventional wisdom is that morals are not that important. It's all national interest. Sometimes you put it, national interest baked the cake, and then politicians come along and sprinkle a little bit of moral icing on it to make it look pretty. I'm arguing that, in fact, if you have that cynical view, you're going to get history wrong. That, in fact, morals and the moral views of the presidents were critical ingredients to the cake that was baked, not just icing sprinkled on top. Mm-hmm. And it's very relevant to where we are now with this current COVID crisis. Everybody's saying borders are back. You can't worry about other people. To put it in Donald Trump's terms, it's America first. And certainly a politician, particularly an elected politician in a democracy, has to put the interests of his or her people first. That's why they were elected. They have a role as a trustee or a fiduciary. But it's one thing to say national interest first. Say Macron would say France first. But it's another thing about how you define the national interest. And that's where the moral element comes in. How broadly or how narrowly do you define it? I've sometimes used a little example of, imagine you were sitting on the beach reading a book, a good book, and you were deeply engrossed in it. You're about to finish a chapter and somebody in the surf cried, "Help, help." Would you put down the book, or you say, "No, I really want to finish this chapter"? Of course, you'd put the book down and you'd jump in if you could and save them. But imagine that instead of hearing "help, help," you heard "ayúdame, ayúdame," or from some foreign language. Would you say, "Oh, it's not an American. I don't have to, I can finish the chapter"? Of course not. You put down the book and try to save them. And in that sense, we all are cosmopolitans and we're all national at the same time. This view that it's either one or the other is wrong. Humans are capable of concentric circles of moral feelings and community. And they basically, you can both feel strongly in favor of your own nation and feel a sense of common humanity at the same time. Now, it's true that loyalty to your own may have a moral component to it. For example, if to keep the same book example on the beach, suppose that you heard the cries for help. You looked down and there were two children drowning in the surf, equally distant, but one of them was yours and the other was not. Would you feel that morally you had to flip a coin to decide which one to save? Of course not. The fact that you were a parent brought in another moral obligation. That child had an expectation, a moral expectation of you, which was in additional to your obligation or to humanity as a whole. So yes, there are different circles, and the national circle may be closer or inner more. It doesn't mean that we ignore those older circles. And that means that in a time like this, it's not establishing borders that totally exclude the rest of the world. It's figuring out reasonable ways to combine our moral obligations. I'm going to come back to this at the end of my brief talk. But first, I want to say that what we're seeing today is a president who has taken an extremely narrow definition of American interests and America first. I look at 14 presidents since 1945 in the book, and if you go back to the earlier presidents like Franklin Roosevelt or Harry Truman or Dwight Eisenhower, they were basically defining the American national interest to promote our interests, but in ways that help others as well. The Marshall Plan to help revive Europe after World War II is a good example of that. It was good for us, but good for others at the same time. The other thing in the book that, in looking at the 14 presidents, that's worthwhile to note is that often these moral decisions were crucially important. I use the example of Harry Truman to illustrate this and nuclear weapons. Many people condemn Truman morally for having dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What they don't realize is that there was a third bomb, and that Truman, when he discovered how bad the effects of nuclear weapons were on humans, told the military they couldn't drop the third bomb. And he said, "I'm not going to kill any more women and children." But even more important, 5 years later, when Truman was stalemated and losing the war in Korea, after the North Koreans had swept down the peninsula and the Chinese came in behind them, and we were almost in risk of being driven off the Korean peninsula, General MacArthur, the commander in the Asia, said that if Truman gave him permission to drop 25 to 40 atomic bombs on Chinese cities, he could win the war. And Truman said no, even though he knew that if he stalemated or lost the war, it would cost him his presidency, which it did. That was a tremendously important decision based in large part on moral grounds. And imagine if he had not decided it that way. Think what a different world we'd be living in if, in fact, nuclear weapons were treated as normal warfighting weapons rather than as just for deterrence purposes. So in that sense, the moral decision that Truman made was critical to the type of world we live in today, not simply icing sprinkled on the cake. But as you mentioned in introducing me in the book, having demonstrated by looking at the 14 presidents that morals did matter, I then say, how do we think about it? It's not as easy as we first say. Very often people will say, well, if a president says nice things about freedom and democracy and so forth, that's moral. Well, no, you can have good intentions and terrible immoral consequences. And I'll give you, again, a simple little example that apply it to foreign policy. Imagine that your daughter was at a high school dance and had SAT exams tomorrow morning, and a friend said, "Oh, I'll pick her up and drive her home, and I'll make sure she gets home quickly and early so she's rested for the exams." And your friend then doesn't notice that the road has become icy, drives at 80 miles an hour, and skids off the road, hits a tree, and your daughter is killed. Would you say, oh, but his intentions were good? Of course not. You say this is a horrible, inappropriate consequence, use of means, inappropriate means with horrible consequences. And this is in what we would call, in legal terms, there was culpable negligence about the means, and it led to basically something that we would not tolerate in terms of the consequences. So in that sense, if you could take it and apply it to something like the invasion of Iraq in 2003, George W. Bush said that he wanted to get at the roots of terrorism in the Middle East by basically bringing democracy to the region. So he was going to overthrow Saddam Hussein, which was done relatively easily, and then was going to democratize Iraq, which of course didn't happen. And you might say, well, but his intentions were good. Ari Fleischer, who was Bush's press secretary, said, well, you have to admire Bush's morality because of his moral clarity. And what I would say, using that example of the road accident, is not at all. You would say, whatever his intentions, he did not pay due diligence to the means. He didn't have adequate means, and the State Department and the intelligence agency were reminding him of that. And he also produced terrible consequences. The strengthening of al-Qaeda in Iraq, which eventually led to the rise of ISIS, the Islamic State, with horrendous consequences. And so we would say, no, failure to do due diligence and culpable negligence and immoral act. So that's an example, if you want, of three-dimensional morality. We can't look just at intentions. We also have to look at the means and the consequences. Now, to shorten things a bit so we can get on to questions, let me apply this to the issue of our current crisis with coronavirus and COVID-19. Basically, what I see in the reactions of President Trump and the United States is an inadequate appreciation of the need to cooperate with others. It's interesting, you can blame the Chinese, indeed they deserve a good deal of blame, with their authoritarian system closing down information and preventing early enough warning of what was going to happen as a result of this virus in Wuhan. And then after that, they turned to a propaganda campaign to try to make themselves look benign, which of course was an exaggeration on their part. But then we replied by talking about the China virus, and Secretary of State Pompeo prevented the Group of Seven from reaching a communique about cooperation because he wouldn't agree to anything that didn't talk about the Wuhan virus, pin it strictly on the Chinese. These, I think, are the wrong ways to approach it. What we know from previous episodes of pandemics, 1918 being probably the most dramatic in the last century, where more people were killed by the so-called Spanish flu than died in all of World War I. What we know is that these pandemics tend to come in waves, and that we should be preparing for a second wave. And if there's going to be a second wave, we and the Chinese should be cooperating, not gaining in propaganda wars and slanging matches. For example, the Chinese have a lot of knowledge and evidence of what the early stages look like. They've done a lot of work on the virus itself. They're big producers of medical equipment and personal protection equipment. So there's a lot to be said for cooperating there. But there's another dimension of cooperation which I would flag, to go back to my point about what's the national interest or not. One of the probabilities, we can't know it for sure, is that this virus may have a seasonal fluctuation. With warmer temperatures in the northern hemisphere, the virus may migrate to the southern hemisphere, and then with the temperature reversals 6 months later, could migrate back up to the northern hemisphere. In other words, you might have a reservoir of coronavirus in a set of countries, many of which are too poor to be able to provide the public health measures that they need. It would very much be in our interest to join with the Chinese and the Europeans and others to create a massive COVID virus fund under the United Nations to help these poor countries to cope with it. And you'd say, well, why, when we're pressed so hard for funding at home, why don't we, in fact, just think of our own needs and not worry about this? And the answer is a little bit like the Marshall Plan, which is we would do it because it is in our interests. We don't want a surge coming up from this reservoir of Southern Hemisphere virus coming back north. So in that sense, it's self-interest. But it's also humanitarian interest. There are a lot of people who can't cope and who we can help without losing our capacity to help ourselves. And that's, of course, what the Marshall Plan was about in 1948. So I would summarize by saying, to go back to where I started, yes, morals do matter. And it doesn't have to be put into, should I act morally or should I act in the national interest? It all depends on how you define the national interest, how broadly or narrowly you define it. And I, alas, feel that we've been defining it in very narrow terms in recent years. And it's time to us to return to the presidents who I look at in the early part of the book, people like Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, who took a broad definition of American national interests that was good for us, but good for others as well. And to me, that's the important example of morals being critical in foreign policy. Anyway, let me stop there and see what other people think.
Okay, I have opened up, the Q&A is open, but I'd rather people type their questions into the chat because I've got two things open here and it's kind of hard. I've also got my own questions. You've raised an awful lot of material there, Joseph, very interesting material. So first of all, you say that as a nation, you mentioned, we haven't dedicated a lot of serious attention to investigating moral values. And you talk about the actual dearth of titles that really, of books even, that address this topic. So I guess my question is, when did morals become so unfashionable? And you hark back again to Theodore Roosevelt saying that America at one point prided itself on its moral exceptionalism and, quote, our chief usefulness, he said, to humanity rests on combining power with higher purpose. So my question is, when did morals become unfashionable and when did all this change?
Well, in the 19th century and the early 20th century, when Teddy Roosevelt made that statement, Americans saw themselves very moral. This is sometimes called American exceptionalism, that we'd broken off from Britain so that we could worship the Lord in a purer way, the Puritans, and therefore we were better. And that sort of moralism was very fashionable. And it characterized American foreign policy in the early part of the 20th century. Woodrow Wilson was often called moralistic. The net result of that was that the United States we talked a good game, but we didn't do what we needed to do to stop Hitler and genocide and the horrors of World War II. So in the aftermath of World War II, there was a whole school of thought, which was well represented by George Kennan, the famous American diplomat who invented the doctrine of containment, but had political thinkers like Hans Morgenthau and others saying America had to drop this moral view, that this was hurting us and hurting others, and they condemned American moralism. So in the 1950s or so, if you were going to graduate school and studying international relations, any reference to morals or morality was a no-no. And it's gradually changed over time, but it was a reaction to the 20s and 30s, I'd say.
So after 1945, America is now a superpower, the post-war period, and it seems to start to associate strength and force of right as a kind of measure of good leadership. Power and good leadership seem to be entwined there. Um, and I remember once hearing Willy Brandt, the Chancellor, the German Chancellor, saying that he thought that being able to admit you were wrong was a sign of great leadership. Can you remember the last time that an American president not only admitted they were wrong, but they were sorry for something?
Well, actually, some have. If you look at Bill Clinton apologizing for American treatment of the Japanese American citizens in World War II, and Congress then reaffirmed that apology. And Barack Obama was criticized by a number of his opponents for his apologies of how the Americans had behaved in the Middle East. So I think it does occur, but you're right, not enough. On the other hand, America is more than just the presidents, and what I call soft power, the ability to attract others or to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment, that comes out of our civil society. And the fact that we have a vibrant press and sometimes in the Congress, strong opinions that are freely expressed about how we're acting incorrectly and apologizing for some of our bad behavior helps to redeem us. In other words, it's not that we're good. We often make mistakes and do bad things, but the fact that we sometimes are able to, as a society, to recognize what we've done wrong, that in the eyes of others can make us attractive even when particular actions are not attractive. I often cite the example from the days of the Vietnam War, when people were marching through the streets around the world condemning American government policy in Vietnam. And the interesting thing was they weren't singing the Communist Internationale of Ho Chi Minh. They were singing Martin Luther King's We Shall Overcome. In other words, an anthem that grew out our ability to remedy one of our greatest sins, if you want, as a people, slavery, had become something that helped to redeem us as a people, even though the policies the government was following at the time were wildly unpopular. So while we had low soft power or attractiveness during the Vietnam War, we were able to recover it in the following decade.
All right, so that was an interesting point, although you could argue, not to split hairs, that, you know, Clinton was apologizing for something that happened on somebody else's watch rather than his own. So, you know, it's very easy to be sorrowful for what somebody else did.
Sure.
Okay, so something else. Let's bring things up to date. I can't avoid, I mean, you mentioned a lot of things about COVID and present international situation we find ourselves in. Margaret Haberman, the journalist you mentioned, said that Trump isn't unique, he's extreme, but surely he's unique to American political history, because you yourself wrote, the high cost of Trump's disdain for international morality, and The Economist also calling Trump's approach to international relations a wrecking ball. I think we should look at two events that stand out in recent times. One, Trump downplaying the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi embassy in Istanbul. And then two, the assassination of the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani in a third country, which we weren't at war with. So now you highlight in an article that he has crossed two red lines just here in these instances. What are they and why is this important?
Well, I am critical of Trump. The Economist reviewed my book this week and focused on the criticisms of Trump. I think the reason I quoted Maggie Haberman in the preface that Trump was not unique but extreme was just to show that we've done some other bad things and other presidents have done some bad things. So, but I think Trump is worse. I mean, I think that he has taken this tendency further than others. And the two incidents you mentioned are good examples of why this is true. When Khashoggi was murdered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Trump basically said, "Get over it. It's a tough world out there," and he treated basically an atrocious murder as just a by the way incident. And even the conservative Wall Street Journal condemned him for that, said we have to be more willing to express American values than that. So that's an example of Trump's being extreme. He's not unique in that sense that some previous American presidents had turned a blind eye to human rights violations, but not waved it off in quite the cavalier way. As for the, do you want to continue that one? Or
well, yes, Bush, you could say, many people thought he should be tried as a war criminal for just ignoring the UN or just completely taking no heed of what they had to advise and invading. And then, Trump does the same kind of thing now. So how can we rest easy in the international arena when we are transgressing these things we've signed, UN human rights charters and such? Why would we expect our officials to be protected?
That's the good example of the Soleimani case that you mentioned. During the Cold War, the United States had a policy of trying to assassinate some foreign leaders. It was part of the Cold War feeling that if they were going to support the Soviet Union, that was a threat to us and so forth. After Vietnam, President Gerald Ford, ended that policy and issued an executive order saying that we would no longer engage in assassination of foreign leaders. And that executive order was in place. But basically, when you found that Trump was willing to assassinate Soleimani, a high official of the Iranian government in a third country, Iraq, that basically meant he breached that order. And you say, well, but Soleimani was a bad guy. That doesn't matter. It's not whether you're a bad guy or not. It's a question of whether you want to have a norm internationally which says you don't do assassinations. Because once you break that norm, once you decide it's easy to cross that line, or anybody can cross that line, what's to protect Secretary of State Pompeo, for example, when he visits Baghdad from being assassinated by an Iranian missile? So I think the two examples you chose of the Khashoggi murder and the Soleimani assassination are illustrations of where Trump has gone further than others.
Okay, so now we come to the word language issue, which I think is so key in all this about morality. How, because Trump has corrupted meaning, people are hard pressed to even use the word lie attached to Trump. We've got post-truth and untruth and fake news. We've got all these euphemisms. You even talk about his looseness with truth, which I thought was really quite quaint. You called about his looseness. Yeah, he's a liar. And I think people should call him on it more often. And I don't know why everyone's scared of that. I remember the Wall Street Journal when he first came in saying, oh, we're not going to say that he lies. They actually adopted that policy. And I was shocked. I thought, why? Why have we got to come up with this whole new lexicon vocabulary to excuse this kind of conduct? Why is that?
I use the term looseness of truth with a tongue in cheek, because there is a section in the book which talks about presidents as liars. And the interesting point is that Trump is not the first president who's told lies. Almost all of them have. And Franklin Roosevelt, who comes out well in my book, nonetheless told some deliberate lies to the American people, such as saying that a German submarine had attacked an American destroyer first, when in fact it was the other way around. He wanted to try to get us into the war against Germany. But there's a difference between telling a lie, which is what you might call an other regarding lie rather than a self-regarding lie. Other regarding lie, Roosevelt's lie was to what he thought was for the good of the American people. If you tell a lie about the number of people attending your inauguration, as Trump did, that's purely self-regarding. There's no other regarding benefit to it. But the larger point about Trump's lies is how many of them there are. Washington Post fact checkers had a statement that by the first 1,000 days of Trump's presidency, he had told something like 15,000 lies. Well, that's extraordinary. I mean, what that does is it debases the currency of truth and trust. And that is very expensive, both to us as a country as well as to our government. So in the book as a whole, there really is quite a harsh discussion of lying. But again, Trump's not the first president who's lied. He's just done it more than anybody else.
Well, maybe he's done it flamboyantly. Now he's got Twitter. I mean, here's one right in front of me that he posted. The fake news media and their Democrat partners are working hard to determine whether or not the future attack by terrorist Soleimani was imminent or not. And was my team in agreement? The answer in both cases is a strong yes, but it doesn't matter. That's the thing that's so insane about the situation. Not only is whether he does what his conduct is, whether it's right or wrong, it doesn't matter. You can be now unaccountable. And I wonder if we can come back from that new position we find ourselves in. Americans are not trusted around the world anymore. Our trust has dropped. You know this, the popularity and trust in American foreign policy.
His destroying trust can be seen in the reduction of American soft power, which is the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment. And in 2017, American soft power was fairly high when Trump took over from Obama. But in the years since then, it's increased very dramatically. And you can see that in the public opinion polls, as well as in an index of soft power that's published in London every year.
And what about trust?
Well, trust, I think, has also been greatly devalued by Trump's behavior. All the evidence we hear from foreign leaders about whether they feel that Trump's word is good or whether American guarantees are good, all these anecdotes tend to be on the negative side, with few exceptions, perhaps, Netanyahu in Israel, and so forth. But by and large, most leaders feel that the American guarantees aren't what they used to be.
So just before I open it up, because we've got some questions coming in now, I have to say that the great "Make America Great Again" that Trump walks around proselytizing the whole time. I recently was in California and I saw a wonderful hat, and somebody had "Make America Decent Again." And I think, do you think we can bring back decency? Do you think it's just something old-fashioned, or do you think people are yearning for that moral compass again?
I think it probably will come back. This tends to go in cycles. Remember, Richard Nixon not only told lies, but he also did some things which were violating constitutional principles and almost became impeached for it. And yet the next two presidents, Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, basically went out of their way to say they would not lie and to make changes that would restore trust.
Okay, Carter's an interesting point we'll come back to, but we've got a couple of questions. One is from Kevin Mayer, and he says, the situation with COVID-19 highlights that we're living in an increasingly interconnected world. How do you view global citizenship in light of this timely conversation?
Well, I think it goes to what I said at the beginning of my talk about the little example of being on the beach. And it doesn't matter whether you hear somebody who claims they need your help to save their life in English or in Spanish. You have a moral obligation in either case. So in that sense, I think you'll find that most Americans really are capable of being national and cosmopolitan at the same time. Now, we're not as cosmopolitan as we are national. That goes back to my other example about the two children that one of whom is yours, that there are additional moral obligations that go with being part of a national community. But the argument that somehow the sort of the Steve Bannon argument that it's cosmopolitans, rootless cosmopolitans against true American nationalists, this is nonsense. That's not who we are as a people.
I forgot to ask you a very important question, which was you deal with 14 presidents in your book. Who comes out on top morally and who is at the bottom of the poll there?
Well, the top presidents are basically FDR, Truman, Eisenhower, and then George H.W. Bush, because in the aftermath of the Cold War, he avoided the temptations to gloat and to glorify. In his words, I'm not going to dance on the wall. I'm going to negotiate with Gorbachev so that this Cold War ends without a shot being fired. That was an extraordinary accomplishment, and a little bit like Truman's not using nuclear weapons. So those are the ones I put as the top four. The bottom four include Lyndon Johnson because of getting us into Vietnam, Richard Nixon because of a variety of misbehaviors that went along with that, George W. Bush for getting us into Iraq in 2003, and Donald Trump, though in all fairness, I have to say the term is not over and we can't give him the full grade, but we certainly would send him home with a note saying needs further work.
Okay, we have a second question here. Pat Serkey, what impact has the globalization of the economy had on the dimensions of political morality?
Well, the globalization of the economy is often blamed for the election of Donald Trump, and in Britain for the decision to leave the European Union and so forth. That what happened with globalization is you had a great increase in economic efficiency. You had supply chains from overseas, but it also meant that certain jobs were lost at home in the US or Britain or elsewhere. And this led to a reaction. Even though the globalization may have been good overall, and various economists will point out that global poverty has actually diminished over the last 20 or 30 years. But poverty, and particularly inequality in parts of the US where jobs were lost, produced a populist type of reaction, which contributed to the election of Donald Trump. So many people argue that more attention should have been paid to the income distribution effects of globalization. We should have done a better job helping those people who were hurt by it. Overall, the country may have benefited, but in terms of not everybody in the country benefiting, we should have done more to have helped those people who were not doing well. And I think that's the lesson of the impact of globalization on politics.
Okay, we got another question from Virginia Benson. Why do you choose to use the word morals rather than ethics? Global ethics, for example, seems to transcend the religious implications that the term morals often carries.
Well, I use the two terms interchangeably. So I usually, when people talk about ethics, they're talking about a larger systemic or systematic coding of normative principles, what one should do or not. Morals is the more common everyday application of it. So the two terms are, if you want a fancier and a less fancy version of the same thing. And in a footnote early in the book, I point this out, that my choice of the word morality was simply to make it closer to the terms that people use in everyday life, but it wasn't a preference for a particular ethical system.
Now, I know you say these things go in waves, but I remember noting when I was teaching after Bush, taking the country to war illegally, it felt to me like there was a general kind of degradation in conduct that I even saw in young people. I saw there being a great surge in texting helped, of course. It's easier to lie through a text than it is face-to-face. That's been proven. But also young people were much more willing to plagiarize other people's work or lie about where something came from, as though, well, there was no consequences for him, so why should I worry about consequences for me? Now, you may say that's a giant leap, but do you think there is a trickle-down effect? If you've got immorality at the national level, do you think it permeates into everyday conduct?
I think it does have an effect. I mean, the causes of changing morality are multiple, and it's not just the internet, it's not just Trump, it's not just generational change. There are multiple causes, but the person in the society who has the best bully pulpit, as Teddy Roosevelt called the presidency, is indeed the president. And if the president is not paying attention to morality or setting a bad example, that is noticed. Or putting it another way around, more people will notice that immoral behavior than anybody else's. And that's an interesting example. This is not a partisan comment. Didn't agree with John McCain's politics, but I've always admired the fact that when he was running in 2008 against Obama, and one of the people in his audience said, oh, Obama's a Muslim and we shouldn't vote for him. And McCain said, no, stop. He's an honorable man. I disagree with him, but we're not going to characterize people by such terms. We're going to deal with their ideas and issues. That's the kind of moral statements you want to hear from a president. It's not the kind of moral statements we're hearing from this president.
Indeed not. Well, Howard Gardner has typed a question in here. I'm going to read it to you. Very good to past Cambridge Forum speaker himself. He says, you focus on presidents. Can you talk a bit about different forms of government, both in parliamentary democracies and in more top-down forms of government, a la Machiavelli, and the extent to which morality figures in decisions and actions?
Well, it's a very interesting question, Howard, and it's true. My book is about American presidents because I wanted to restrict the sample to a group in which I could say, looking at all 14 presidents, did morals matter or not matter? Otherwise, I could be accused of just cherry picking from randomly around the world. But obviously, these same sets of questions can be raised for any political system, whether it's a parliamentary democracy or even an autocracy of sorts, which is to what extent are people being judged by their intentions, their means they choose, and the consequences they have. I think that can be applied anywhere. I've often been torn, though, to take a concrete example of this, is in 2015, when Chancellor Angela Merkel, faced with this influx of 1 million Syrian refugees swarming into Europe, and she made a statement saying, we can handle that. And I remember thinking at the time, this is an extraordinary statement. She's the daughter of a Lutheran pastor in East Germany who grew up under a very repressive system. And she made a sort of a statement which was similar to Martin Luther's I can do no other, a very a type of moral statement which is not thinking about consequences. And at the time, I thought, good for her. She's redeemed my view of what Germany has done in the past. But it's interesting to note that one of the consequences was to weaken the conservatives who, in her own party, and to open the doors for the party called the Alternative for Germany, AfD, which is a right-wing neo-Nazi type party. And my German friends tell me that, yes, they admire Merkel's moral stand on the refugees, but they wish she'd done it in a slightly different way with more attention to the consequences on German politics over a longer run. There are hard calls like this, and they're true whether it's a presidential system or a parliamentary system.
It is going to be interesting. You raised the issue this morning about, earlier, about the COVID epidemic, or pandemic, and how various governments are dealing with it. Some could say there's been this kind of rise of nationalism in a way, lots of celebration of being proud of one's homeland, countryland. And then I look at the performance of various governments and their ability to tell the truth about what's been going on, the accountability again. And can we employ your three measures in a country, say China, where you could argue, well, this is our agenda, these are the means we employ, and we're willing to take the consequences because they don't tally with our American values. So it's very hard to judge whether somebody's doing the right thing if the right thing is expediency and looking good. If that's your most important, your prime consideration as a country, looking good to the world rather than cooperating or admitting. I thought it was rather interesting that China apparently is helping us out, which on one level you think this is remarkably wonderful humanitarian assistance. And then you see today in the New York Times, it's really a diversion away from the actual statistics of what's going on in their own country. So it's hard not to be cynical.
Well, that's true, but it's also worth, I've just written a column this week for Project Syndicate, which says that both Chinese and American leadership have failed the COVID test. It's interesting to see the parallels between an authoritarian and a democratic system. The first reaction of both Xi Jinping and Trump was denial. It's not real, it's not serious, it'll go away. And that meant they lost the time they needed to do the careful testing and process tracing, which would have meant isolation in a less costly way. China then went to isolation of Wuhan and then claims that it stamped it out, but many people, including CIA, believe that these Chinese numbers are political numbers rather than real numbers. And then China and the US both got into a slanging match about who was wrong, who was right. And I mentioned this earlier, that a foreign ministry spokesman in China talked about the American military bringing the virus to Wuhan, using to sign a G7 communique, which didn't blame China for the virus. This type of thing inhibits communication. Inhibits cooperation. But if I'm right about new waves, we're going to need, both the US and China are going to need to learn to cooperate. And so I hope that, that we will both learn that the consequences, the highly immoral consequences of the way we've treated it, or our leadership has treated it in its early stages in both countries. Nonetheless, I think that, the Chinese are making major efforts to so-called mask diplomacy to pose as benign. But the authoritarian system, which suppressed information for over a month, was not at all benign. And you can't make up for that now by simply donating a lot of face masks. And similarly, the United States, Trump says, well, I cut down on flights from China, but then he wasted the next month and did nothing about preparing for the spread. So I think both leaders should be judged as as putting their self-interest first and not the benefit of their people or broadly of the planet. And the reason I wrote this column was a plea for, on round two, which I'm afraid we face, let's do better.
Okay, we have one last question from an anonymous attendee. What opportunities do you see for the emergence of more moral leadership in the present COVID crisis?
Well, I think we have noted that there are people who do place truth and evidence above self-interest. Everybody extols the fact that Dr. Fauci science. I mean, he has to be careful, but nonetheless doesn't say things that are unscientific. And I think also we had another, if you want, lesson in civics during the impeachment hearings, when people like Fiona Hill, who had served on the National Security, or Colonel Vindman, who'd served in the White House, and basically were willing to risk their careers by telling the truth, rather than succumbing to what was opportunistically in their interests. And I was interested that that lesson of civic virtue and the importance of truth was taught to the American people by civil servants. One, basically somebody who had worked in the intelligence community and then the Brookings Institution, the other who was served in the American military. And interestingly enough, both of them were immigrants who actually believed what the American idea is about. So I think there is a prospect for returning to a more moral situation.
Okay, I'm not going to visit the thing that really I got into an argument with somebody over last night, not an argument, disagreement, about the conduct of this captain of this ship who blew the whistle on the situation on board at the cost to his own career, which I felt he must surely have done because of his men, to protect his men. And I got into quite a barney with someone last night and said they didn't go through the right channels and this and that. And I felt like he probably had exhausted the channels before that story got out. But so I didn't think that was a great example for our children, that this man did such a noble thing and has paid a huge price for it. So I guess there's full of there's always going to be the exceptions to the rule there. And we don't really know the true story either about that one. So unfortunately, we're coming up to the end of our time here. I just wanted to close by, first of all, saying thank you to everybody for listening and chiming in. And I think we're getting better at this, and I do appreciate your patience.